The political landscape of Texas in the early 20th century was defined by fierce ideological battles, dramatic personalities, and the lingering effects of national upheaval. As the state moved through the 1920s and 1930s, its leadership confronted challenges ranging from widespread corruption and economic instability to racial violence, rapid industrial expansion, and the mounting pressures of the Great Depression. Against this turbulent backdrop emerged a succession of influential governors: Dan Moody, Ross Sterling, Miriam Ferguson, and James V. Allred, each leaving a distinct imprint on Texas politics. Their administrations reflected both the promise and the limitations of reform during an era when Texans demanded accountability, stability, and strong leadership amid widespread uncertainty. Against this backdrop, Dan Moody rose to prominence early in his career by prosecuting a group involved in criminal activities allegedly tied to the Ku Klux Klan, sending several members to prison and earning statewide recognition despite strong Klan resistance. This reputation helped him win election as Attorney General at the start of Governor Miriam Ferguson's first administration. Soon thereafter, major scandals erupted over state highway contracts, and as Attorney General he moved to invalidate what he called unconscionable agreements. His successful prosecution of these cases positioned him as the leading challenger to Governor Ferguson when she sought a second term. Building on that momentum, the ensuing campaign became one of the most dramatic in Texas political history. Running on a platform that supported prohibition, woman suffrage, and a range of anti-Ferguson reforms, Moody narrowly led the first 1926 primary with 49.9% of the vote before decisively defeating Ferguson in the runoff. Even after consolidating power at home, he secured renomination in the 1928 Democratic primary with a clear majority. Yet the party fractured during that year's presidential race over issues of prohibition and Catholicism. Despite Moody's appeals for party unity, Republican Herbert Hoover ultimately carried Texas. Once in office, Moody pursued an ambitious program of reform. He ended the liberal convict pardon policies associated with the Fergusons and initiated a major overhaul of the state's prison system. He also reorganized the state highway system, establishing a coordinated network of roads and cutting construction costs to nearly half of what they had been under the previous administration. In the realm of fiscal accountability, his tenure saw the creation of the State Auditor's Office and the implementation of formal auditing of state accounts. Even so, although deeply aligned with the progressive movement of his time, Moody was not able to push through several large-scale structural reforms he believed necessary. Efforts to revise the state constitution, establish a strong civil service law, reorganize the executive branch, and separate categories of taxation all fell short. He also advocated consolidating all state prison properties into a centralized penal colony near Austin, another proposal that ultimately failed to gain legislative approval. If Moody's tenure emphasized administrative reform, his successor, Ross Sterling, confronted unprecedented turmoil in the East Texas oil fields, where rapid and unregulated development created chaos in both production and pricing. The Railroad Commission attempted to impose proration to stabilize the industry, but the courts initially struck down its efforts. As conditions deteriorated, Sterling declared martial law in 4 affected counties and deployed the National Guard to curb waste and enforce limits on production. Although the intervention halted operations temporarily, both a federal district court and the U.S. Supreme Court later ruled that Sterling had exceeded his authority. Ironically, the courts ultimately accepted the Railroad Commission's proration plan, validating the regulatory approach Sterling had originally supported. Compounding these regulatory struggles, Sterling's administration faced additional difficulties during the Great Depression, particularly the dramatic decline in cotton prices. In September 1931, he called a special legislative session to address the agricultural crisis, resulting in the Texas Cotton Acreage Control Law of 1931-32. Intended to reduce cotton production, the law was soon declared unconstitutional and never implemented. Ultimately, these compounding challenges shaped Sterling's political fate. In the 1932 Democratic primary, the closest primary loss ever suffered by an incumbent U.S. governor, he was narrowly defeated by Miriam Ferguson in a runoff decided by less than 4,000 votes, with a final margin of 50.2% to 49.8%. Leaving office in January 1933, Sterling returned to Houston and largely withdrew from public life. Nevertheless, he quickly rebuilt his personal fortune through new ventures in the oil industry and went on to serve as president of the Sterling Oil and Refining Company from 1933 to 1946. In the wake of Sterling's defeat, Miriam Ferguson again sought the Texas governorship, narrowly defeating the incumbent for the Democratic nomination before decisively beating Republican Orville Bullington in the general election with more than 61% of the vote. Although Bullington performed better than most Republicans of the era, he still fell far short of challenging Ferguson's strong support in a year dominated by Democratic victories nationally, including Franklin D. Roosevelt's election to the presidency. Once back in office, Ferguson's second term proved far less turbulent than her first, though rumors circulated that state highway contracts were awarded only to businesses advertising in the Ferguson's newspaper, the Ferguson Forum. A legislative investigation followed, but produced no charges. Meanwhile, the overwhelming pressures of the Great Depression forced deep cuts across state agencies, including the Texas Rangers, whose manpower dropped to 45 officers with little more than railroad passes and personal horses for transportation. The Rangers further undermined themselves by openly supporting Sterling in the 1932 campaign, prompting Ferguson, upon taking office in January 1933, to dismiss the entire force. With legislative funding also slashed, Ranger strength dwindled to just 32 men. As a result, the weakened agency became incapable of countering the explosion of Depression-era crime, as notorious outlaws such as Bonnie and Clyde, Pretty Boy Floyd, Raymond Hamilton, and Machine Gun Kelly found Texas an easy refuge from law enforcement. In response to this deteriorating public safety landscape, the Texas legislature commissioned a Chicago consulting firm to study the problem. The resulting report described a security system that was underfunded, understaffed, poorly coordinated, and outdated. The consultants recommended a sweeping reorganization, including merging the Rangers with the Texas Highway Patrol to form a new statewide law enforcement agency. Acting on these recommendations, the legislature adopted this plan in 1935 under Governor James V. Allred, establishing the Texas Department of Public Safety with an initial budget of $450,000. Even amid these pressures, Ferguson's second administration avoided the intense controversy of her first. A fiscally conservative steward of state finances, she held expenditures down and even advocated a state sales tax and corporate income tax, though the legislature did not act on these proposals. She maintained her traditionally liberal pardons and parole policies, which drew less criticism during the Depression because each release reduced the state's financial burden. At the same time, in 1933 she signed House Bill 194, which elevated the University of Houston to a 4-year institution. Her political comeback proved timely. As Texas felt the full force of the Depression, much of the public blame fell on Sterling rather than on Ferguson, aiding her narrow primary victory and eventual return to office. When Ferguson stepped aside after her second term, she largely retired from Texas politics, although she made an unsuccessful bid to replace W. Leo Daniel when he was elected to the U.S. Senate in a special election in 1941. Her retirement allowed Attorney General James V. Allred to succeed her. Allred had an excellent reputation as a lawyer. In 1923, Governor Pat M. Neff appointed Allred to fill an unexpired term as district attorney for the 30th Texas District, covering Wichita, Archer, and Young counties. Echoing Moody's earlier anti-Klan efforts, he quickly gained statewide attention as the fighting district attorney for his vigorous opposition to the Ku Klux Klan. Although he lost a close runoff for Attorney General in 1926, Allred returned to win the office in 1930 by defeating the incumbent. As Attorney General, he earned broad popular support through his aggressive pursuit of monopolies, large corporations, and attempts by powerful business interests to influence state taxation and fiscal policy. Consequently, this reputation, combined with widespread Depression-era distrust of large corporations, made Allred a natural candidate for governor in 1934. His reform-minded platform called for a state commission to regulate public utilities, a graduated chain store tax to curb the influence of large retail chains, stricter oversight of lobbyists, and opposition to a statewide sales tax that he believed would unfairly burden low-income Texans. He also proposed submitting prohibition repeal to a public vote, despite his personal opposition, and advocated transferring the governor's broad pardoning powers to a board of pardons and paroles. Financially, he argued that state revenue needs could be met through more equitable property valuation and more efficient use of existing funds rather than through new general taxes. Once elected, he pursued both his reform agenda and active cooperation with federal New Deal programs, relying on the Texas Planning Board to align state initiatives with nationwide recovery efforts. Although he secured passage of several significant measures, legislative resistance to increased revenue left programs such as expanded education funding, highway improvements, the establishment of the Texas Department of Public Safety, and the beginnings of old age pensions on shaky financial ground. In energy policy, Allred also helped create the Interstate Oil Compact Commission, which prevented federal intervention in petroleum production. By 1936, Allred had earned national recognition. President Franklin D. Roosevelt praised Texas's role in the national recovery effort, and the National Junior Chamber of Commerce named Allred the Outstanding Young Man in America in 1935. Capitalizing on these successes and having fulfilled many of his 1934 campaign promises, he won re-election in 1936. His second term brought enactment of a teacher retirement system, expanded welfare and social security measures, additional education funding, strengthened state agencies, and increased compensation for state officials, though the legislature again failed to provide sufficient revenue to fully support these programs. Near the end of his second term, Roosevelt nominated Allred to a federal district judgeship, and he assumed the position after leaving the governorship. He resigned in 1942 to run for the U.S. Senate, but was defeated by former Governor W. Lee O'Daniel. After a brief return to private practice in Houston, his appointment to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in 1943 was blocked by O'Daniel. Nevertheless, President Harry S. Truman later restored him to the federal bench in 1949, where he served until his death 10 years later. As the New Deal waned by the late 1930s, the gathering tensions that would soon culminate in the Second World War, combined with a more conservative shift in Congress, brought most New Deal legislation to a halt. Against this shifting national backdrop, Texas entered the final phase of the era with its last New Deal period governor, W. Lee "Pappy" O'Daniel. Unlike his predecessors, O'Daniel's rise to political prominence began not in government, but in advertising. In the 1920s, as sales manager for Burris Mills in Fort Worth, he oversaw the company's radio promotions, writing songs, discussing religious topics on the air, and cultivating an image of down-home sincerity. He helped form a musical group, the Light Crust Doughboys, to bolster the Mills' advertising reach. And in 1935, after establishing his own flour company, Hillbilly Flour, he organized a new band to promote it. Buoyed by this celebrity, his radio broadcasts made him a household name, and his listeners soon urged him to run for governor. During the Democratic primary, effectively the decisive contest in one-party Texas, O'Daniel leaned fully into a crafted hillbilly persona. He championed the Ten Commandments, praised Hillbilly Flour, and promised old-age pensions, tax cuts, and greater industrial development. With public relations experts guiding his image, he toured Texas with a Bible in hand and the hillbilly boys at his side, attracting enormous crowds, especially in rural areas. Unsurprisingly, his popularity proved overwhelming. He crushed his opponents and avoided a runoff entirely. Once in office, however, O'Daniel reneged on nearly all his major promises. Despite pledging to block a sales tax, end capital punishment, eliminate the poll tax, which he himself had failed to pay, and increase pensions, he reversed course. He introduced a tax bill secretly written by manufacturing lobbyists, a multi-layered sales tax in disguise, which the legislature rejected. Though many lawmakers mocked what they considered the vaudevillian nature of his administration, a large number of his legislative critics were defeated in the next election, a reminder of his persistent public appeal. Nevertheless, O'Daniel won re-election in 1940 after dramatically claiming he had informed President Roosevelt of a supposed fifth-column threat in Texas, though no evidence of such traitors ever surfaced. In 1941, he and several Allied business leaders launched attacks on organized labor, though most provisions of his O'Daniel Anti-Violence Act were struck down in court. At the same time, he reshaped the University of Texas Board of Regents by appointing members determined to limit academic freedom and pursue alleged subversives on campus. These regents, together with those appointed by his successor, Coke Stevenson, ultimately dismissed University of Texas President Homer Price Rainey, prompting a 9-year censure of the university by the American Association of University Professors. Substantively, however, O'Daniel accomplished little of his stated agenda. His inability to negotiate effectively with the legislature, along with a pattern of vetoing bills he appeared not to fully understand, left him isolated. The legislature overrode 12 of his 57 vetoes, an extraordinary figure. Even so, his unmatched knack for radio communication allowed him to maintain public support despite legislative stagnation. Seeking a new stage, in 1941, he ran in a special election for the U.S. Senate and narrowly defeated his principal opponent, New Deal Congressman Lyndon B. Johnson, amid a flurry of contested late votes. Once in the Senate, he introduced several anti-labor proposals, all of which were soundly rejected. He sought re-election in 1942, facing former governors James Allred and Dan Moody, and claimed that professional politicians, major newspapers, and communistic labor leader racketeers were conspiring against him. Although embarrassed conservatives and conservative newspapers backed Allred, O'Daniel still managed, by identifying himself as a loyal Roosevelt supporter, to retain enough rural and elderly voters to scrape out a victory. In Washington, his Senate career proved ineffective. He participated in a third-party movement in 1944 aimed at preventing Roosevelt from winning a fourth term, and by 1948 his approval rating had collapsed to about 7%. Opting not to seek re-election, he later attempted unsuccessful bids for the Democratic nomination for Texas governor in 1956 and 1958, failing to reach a runoff in either race. Yet despite his thin legislative record, O'Daniel's legacy endured into the 21st century. In 2000, he served as the historical inspiration for Governor Menelaus "Pappy" O'Daniel in the Coen brothers' film "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?", preserving his distinctive mixture of populism, showmanship, and political theatre for modern audiences. Taken together, the governorships of Moody, Sterling, Ferguson, and Allred reveal a period of sweeping change, competing visions, and unresolved tensions within Texas political life. Their efforts to confront corruption, regulate powerful industries, reorganize state institutions, and manage the profound social and economic strains of the Depression left legacies that were sometimes transformative and sometimes incomplete. While some, such as Allred, emerged as respected reformers, others, like Ferguson and O'Daniel, remained deeply polarizing figures, remembered as much for their controversies as for their accomplishments. Even so, taken as a whole, their administrations capture a defining chapter in Texas history, illustrating how a diverse set of leaders grappled with the demands of modernization, the weight of public expectation, and the shifting political landscape of a rapidly changing state.